So hello and welcome to another episode of Geographics. I'm your host Carl Smallwood, and today we're talking about the Nile, Egypt's eternal river. This video is based on an original article by Ben Adelman. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, and links to their socials can be found below. Without further ado, let's go. Herodotus, the Greek father of history, very famously wrote that Egypt was a gift of the river. No one ever needs clarification on which river he's talking about because there's only one river that matters in Egypt, the Nile. For thousands of kilometres, the Nile cuts a path through the northeastern corner of Africa, a small strip of green in an otherwise endless desert. It's hard to overstate the importance of the Nile in the development of Egypt. For most ancient Egyptians, it was the focal point of their entire lives, providing food, water and wealth, as well as being the primary source of transportation and communication for one of the world's first superpowers. The ancient Egyptians believed that the Nile was divine in origin, that it was controlled by the gods and required a complex religious order in order to continue to appease them and to ensure their nation continued to prosper. However, in recent decades, many have begun to fear the health of the eternal river, which is beset by problems caused not by an angry god, was a direct result of man's attempts to control the awesome power of nature for his own ends. The pharaohs may be gone, but millions of modern day Egyptians still depend on the Nile for their lives and livelihoods. So if something happens to it, it could spell disaster for the country that is so inextricably linked and entwined with it. The total length of the Nile is a mind-boggling 6,650 kilometres, or about 4,130 miles, which is 200 kilometres longer than the distance between New York City and Algiers. It is usually considered the longest river in the world, though in recent years, some scholars have asserted that the Amazon River in South America may in fact be slightly longer than the Nile. The difference comes from how exactly you're supposed to measure the length of the river, which is far from an exact science, even though you think it would be a matter of just getting a really, really long tape measure. 90% of the Nile's waters come from Lake Tana in northwestern Ethiopia, a major tributary. The Blue Nile flows into the shape of a fish hook through Ethiopia and Sudan. It joins together with another major tributary, the White Nile, which begins far to the south in Uganda at the Sudanese capital, Khartoum, to become the Nile proper. Now, ancient people who lived in Sudan and Egypt were almost entirely reliant on the Nile because it was pretty much the only water they had. It's some of the only water that flows through some of the driest regions on planet Earth, where hot temperatures are the norm and it almost never rains. Even today, despite being one of the largest countries in the Middle East, over 95% of Egypt's 110 million people live in a small strip of land comprising about 5% of the country's actual total land area. The difference is so stark that you can literally see it from space, a small ribbon of green winding through an endless sea of brown. The Nile is not an overly large river in terms of the amount of water flowing through it. It has an average water discharge of about 2,800 metres cubed, a small fraction of other great rivers like the Mississippi, 17,000, and the Yangtze, 30,000. It's almost a literal drop in the bucket compared to the huge outflow of the Amazon, an impressive 209,000 metres cubed. But one of those things that makes the Nile so impressive compared to those rivers is a unique meteorological quirk that comes around annually with such clockwork accuracy, you can quite literally set your calendar to it. Most of the Nile's water originate in the Ethiopian highlands, a mountainous region known as the Roof of Africa because it is the highest sustained elevated area on the entire continent. Rainwater flows down the mountains into various streams and rivers that eventually end up in Lake Tana, which feeds the Nile. This water flow is fairly low for most of the year, except during the annual rainy season, which lasts from June to September. During this time, the high mountains capture the monsoon rains coming from the Indian Ocean, and the amount of water flowing into the Nile increases dramatically, up to 15 times its normal amount. Now, all this water is spilled over its banks and inundated into the surrounding valley, turning towns into islands from July until October, when the floodwaters recede and the river regains its banks. Throughout most of human history, floods have been considered bad things, major disasters that swept away buildings and drowned people by the hundreds, if not thousands, but the annual flood in Egypt were a regular occurrence, so much so that the Egyptians could determine with near pinpoint accuracy which areas were safe to build settlements on. Most of modern day Egypt's major towns and cities have their origins in ancient villages that were usually spots of high ground when floods came. That's pretty cool, actually. Like, they always talk about, the ancient Egyptians, and there was one of those alien shows, like, how did they build a pyramid? It's like, I don't know, maybe they just stacked rocks on top of each other until they didn't fall down. But this is actually legit impressive. And the annual inundation was considered a gift by the Egyptians, not only for all the extra water it provided to them during the hottest part of the summer, but also for what it left behind when the water receded. Millions of tons of nutrient-rich, dark-coloured alluvial soil. The sediment was brought from the south along with the water, and when deposited along the Nile's banks, proved to be perfect for agriculture. The floodwaters were so important to the ancient Egyptians that they literally set their calendars by them. The season of Akhet, or inundation, was the start of the Egyptian New Year and was followed by the seasons of Peret, or emergence, when the crops were planted, and then the Shemu, or harvest, when the fields were cleared to prepare for the start of the cycle all over again. The Nile and its floods turned ancient Egypt into one of the world's first superpowers. Their secret was their vast agricultural capacity, growing wheat, linseed and papyrus as staple crops. Most years they produced far more than they needed, which allowed Egypt to develop trade networks with neighbouring regions, bringing wealth in the form of gold and luxury goods. Egypt's rulers, the pharaohs, used this wealth to fund military expeditions that brought in new territories and, of course, more wealth, as well as through the building of huge stone monuments, especially the great tombs they would be buried in. The Nile helped in this way too. As a transportation hub, it was the fastest way to get from one end of the country to the other, and often the only way to move the massive stone blocks using the construction of buildings like the pyramids from the quarries located upriver. The Egyptians of altogether more humble means utilised the Nile for buildings too. Most of the homes occupied by everyday citizens were made from bricks made of mud taken from its riverbanks. Almost all Egyptians recognised the importance of the Nile as a key to their success as a culture and a people, and they referred to it as simply Itaru, or which quite literally means the river, because there was no other body of water that mattered. It was only that one. As for the name the Nile, that would come later with the Greek Nilos and Latin Nilus. One of their most worshipped deities was Hapi, the god of inundation, supposedly responsible for the annual flooding by releasing the waters from the afterlife through a cavern located below the Elephantine Islands in the south of Egypt. The floods were so important to Egypt's economy that they developed a measuring stick called a nilometer to measure the level of inundation in order to determine the economic forecast for the coming year. If there wasn't enough flooding, famine and economic disaster loomed ahead, while too much water would cause flooding in areas where it wasn't supposed to, causing destruction to settlements and loss of life. A very delicate balance, as you can imagine. When the floods were just right, as it were, then it promised a bountiful harvest. Sophisticated networks of retaining ponds, canals and water wheels were built all along the river's banks, allowing farmers to capture floodwaters and store it to irrigate their crops. It also allowed them to redirect the water into new areas, allowing for additional fields to cultivate yet more crops. Some of the oldest surviving written records in existence are ledgers recording the annual floodwater levels as measured by the nilometer, as well as the economic figures, evidence of a growing necessity to keep track of all the kingdom's assets. Most everyday communications were etched into clay tablets, while more important communications were inked on papyrus sheets. Most important of all were the famous hieroglyphics, usually found painted onto monuments or tombs, indicating that it was mostly reserved for religious and ceremonial purposes. The emerging empires around the Mediterranean looked at the wealth and splendour of Egypt with envy, and many of them sought to take it for themselves. Egypt had been invaded before by the Arisians, the Nubians and the Persians, but in 332 BC, foreigners arrived to stay when the country was conquered by Alexander the Great, who founded the city of Alexandria on the western edge of the Nile Delta on the shores of the sea before departing to continue his war of conquest in the east. After he died, the empire was split amongst his generals. One of them was Ptolemy, who set up shop in Egypt. What followed was the 300-year Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, which in turn was supplanted by the Romans, who considered Egypt to be the breadbasket of their empire, supplying a large amount of the grain eaten in Rome itself. Rome's successors, the Byzantines, were swept from power by the invading Arabs, followers of the Prophet Muhammad, and a series of Muslim dynasties were established in Egypt over the course of the next 1,000 years or so. Finally, the European powers arrived and began exercising increased influence over the country, culminating in naming Egypt a British protectorate in the first half of the 20th century. Not until 1952, when Gamal Abdel Nasser came to power after the deposing of the last monarch in a coup, did native Egyptians once again have rule over their own country. Every group of foreigners that came to Egypt was entranced by the country itself, from the great monuments to the Nile. The Greeks in particular couldn't understand why the river would always flood during the height of summer, which is a period of drought in their homeland. They agreed with the Egyptians that it must be divine in origin, because how else would you explain it? The Romans, on the other hand, used the vast farmlands of Egypt to pay off retiring legionnaires after they completed their 25 years of service, and many emperors made the trip to one of the empire's most important provinces, including Hadrian and his young lover Antinius, who drowned in the Nile in 130 AD during an imperial pleasure cruise. Hadrian was so grief-stricken that he ordered shrines to be built worshipping Antinius across the empire, as well as a new Roman city in the spot where his lover had died, which remember was the middle of a river. The Fatimid Caliphate established a new capital city, Cairo, on the banks of the Nile, not far from the site of the ancient Egyptian city of Memphis. In the 10th and 11th centuries, Cairo was considered one of the world's foremost centres of learning and splendour, and is today the 12th largest metropolitan area in the entire world, home to more than 20 million people. The caliphs and the sultans too recognised how important the river was to the economy of the country, holding an annual festival of the Nile to celebrate the annual floods. Europeans began to come to Egypt in large numbers during the 19th century, especially wealthy citizens who were in poor health, who took to wintering in the warm, dry climate of Egypt in an attempt to improve conditions like tuberculosis. It was also believed that bathing or drinking in the waters of the Nile could cure diseases or make someone healthier. When these early tourists returned to their home with fantastical stories of what they'd seen and experienced, suddenly Egypt was the go-to holiday destination for anyone who could afford it. This caused a wave of Western tourism, especially river cruises up and down the Nile, which resulted in a new boom in hotels, restaurants and other businesses catering to the tourists in places like Aswan, Luxor and Cairo. Nile cruises are still an important aspect of the tourist industry in modern Egypt, as people flock to see monuments like the Valley of the Kings in Luxor or the spectacular natural sights of the Nile Valley itself, like all the crocodiles. I just really like crocodiles. In the 19th century, Egypt's rulers, backed by European investors and engineers, looked to modernise the country, which in many areas didn't look all too different from what you might have expected to find back when the pharaohs were still in charge. In addition to massive engineering projects like the opening of the Suez Canal, we all remember that, the ever given, the one time during the pandemic that life made sense. Many methods were sought to increase the agricultural output, still the lifeblood of the Egyptian economy. If they could increase production of 2 or even 3 crop harvests a year, the amount of wealth that could be obtained was, to put it simply, staggering. However, this would require intensive year-round irrigation as well as a system to prevent the fields from being flooded for months at a time. In other words, they needed to control the Nile by building a dam. This wasn't a new idea. Way back in the 11th century, Fatimid Caliph Al-Hakim B. Amar Allah wanted a dam to regulate the Nile's floods and called on noted scholar and polymath Ibn al-Haytham. I had to be confident, didn't I? You had to be confident, Carl, and then absolutely mess it up the second time. To design and build one for him, Al-Hathim quickly concluded that such a scheme was impossible with the methods he then had at his disposal, but you couldn't tell the Caliph things he didn't want to hear if you valued your life. So he made the obvious choice of pretending that he'd gone mad, ending up kept under house arrest in Cairo for a decade until the Caliph died. That right there, folks, is dedication. In 1898, construction of a dam near Aswan began, engineered and supervised by the British, in what today is called the Aswan Low Dam. It was completed in 1902. It was a simple design that still permitted passage of the annual floodwaters, but in a more controlled manner. However, it was eventually judged to be inadequate for Egypt's needs. If they were truly to be a modern nation, it was felt that a new dam was needed, one that would trap the floodwaters behind them in a reservoir that allowed for a constant flow of water all year round, as well as provide for hydroelectricity generation. When General Nasser took power in 1952, one of his biggest priorities was building up Egypt's infrastructure, and a new dam was on the top of the list. In order to procure funding for it, NASA played into the Cold War tensions of the period by essentially forcing the United States and the Soviet Union to compete with one another by offering aid and favourable terms for construction. Eventually, the USSR agreed to provide over $1 billion, as well as technical engineers to build the Aswan High Dam. When construction began in 1960, many fears were raised about both the environmental and human cost of such a construction. Over 100,000 people in Egypt and Sudan were forced from their homes and relocated by their respective governments because they were in the path of the new reservoir, with little else offered to compensate them for their loss, and massive effort by UNESCO. Meanwhile, worked to relocate priceless ancient monuments that were at risk of being submerged to safer locations, including, quite famously, the temples of Abu Simbel. Not all monuments were saved, however, and they were permanently inundated with the opening of the reservoir at Lake Nasser in 1970. The High Dam seemed to be an economic success from the moment it opened, dramatically increasing farming output while also providing much needed power to the country's infrastructure. But in recent years, more and more problems have been spotted that can be directly or indirectly blamed on the reservoir, which completely ended the cycle of annual flooding that for so long dictated Egyptian life. The Aswan High Dam lets water through at a consistent rate, but all the tons of sediment that was normally carried with the floodwaters is trapped behind it. This has led to worries that the future of soil, which is showing signs of nutrient leaching and increased amounts of salt, the lack of soil deposits is also causing erosion of land in the delta region at an average rate of 150 metres annually. Nutrient loss is causing more and more money to be spent annually on artificial fertiliser, which both eats into the profit margin and is linked to the negative health effects on the local population, something that obviously didn't happen when the river just did it for itself. The environmental effects of the huge new artificial lake have also been felt. Lake Nasser has actually changed the climate in southern Egypt and northern Sudan, making it rain in places where it never rained before. The large open body of water is also a breeding ground for disease-carrying pests, leading to an increased number of people affected with malaria and, this is a word, schistosomiasis, along with other afflictions. Other animals, meanwhile, have disappeared from the Nile Valley altogether, most notably, the Nile crocodile, which for millennia was the most feared predator on the river, but is now trapped behind the dam. never to be seen in the waters beyond it again. Oh no, they trapped all the crocodiles. I don't like the idea of all those trapped crocodiles. Let them out. Free the crocodiles. Among many Egyptians, but also among many scientific experts, there are real fears that the dam might be strangling the Nile to death, and because of how intertwined the destinies of the Nile and Egypt are, if the Nile dies, surely Egypt must die along with it. Attempts to mitigate these issues have been stymied in recent years by the frequent unrest within Egypt, which has resulted in the toppling of 2 different governments within the last decade alone. There are also potential trouble brewing upriver as well. As much as Egypt identifies with the Nile, the river doesn't begin within their own borders, and other nations have ideas about what to do with the waters of the Nile, as well. In particular, the governments of Egypt and Sudan have been in a long-running dispute with the neighbouring Ethiopia over the latter's building of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD. This massive new dam will block up the Blue Nile within Ethiopia, creating a large reservoir that will help the country produce electricity, as well as serve as a safeguard against drought in future years. However, both Egypt and Sudan have protested its construction, claiming that the new dam will infringe upon their own water rights, that it might impact their own water retention and hydroelectric production efforts. In recent years, talks have broken down and all sides have stepped up military preparation efforts, sparking fears of a water war over the Nile that would surely end in bloodshed. In many places along the banks of the Nile, particularly in rural areas, life continues much as it has done for thousands of years, far removed from the concerns of modern day life, yet no one living in this unstable region can be free from worry about the future of one of the world's most famous rivers. In coming years and decades, many questions will need to be answered, some of them looming large over the lives of millions. Who does the Nile belong to? The farmers or the tourists? Who should control the water? Those who live where it ends or where it begins? Are the long-term environmental and human consequences of damming the river worth the short-term economic benefits of doing so? Etc, etc. There's no easy answer to any of these questions, but they will need to be answered one way or the other. And soon, because Mother Nature is left to choose for us, the odds are not so good of a favourable outcome. For thousands of years, the Nile has dominated the destinies of everyone who lives near it, particularly those in Egypt. Whether or not it continues to do so in the modern era is at this point almost entirely up to those same people. So thank you for tuning into this episode of Geographics. As noted at the start of this piece, this video is based on an original article by Ben Adelman. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. You can find links to their socials below if they were provided to us. I've been your host, Carl Smallwood. I also host videos for the sister sites Geographics, Biographics and Top 10s. I've also got my own channel, Facting with Carl Smallwood, and another channel I run with a friend called Wiki Weekends. The style over there is altogether less formal, and we usually have a beer or two. So if you thought I was struggling to read out the words in this one, go check out that if you're interested. But otherwise, thank you for tuning in. Leave a like if you like the video, comment if you've got any further things to say about it, subscribe if you want to see more. And finally, have the day you all deserve. Cheers.